Hello, everyone, and welcome to this introduction to the podcast edition of this week's program. I'm in Birmingham, Alabama. I'm sad. I'm coming to the end of the great John Steinbeck 2024 Travels with Charlie journey. I've gone 18,000 miles. I've got about 600 more to get to the end, which is in Salisbury, North Carolina, the home of one Russell Eagle and his wonderful wife, Liz Eagle. They're going to take care of the rig, the Airstream, for the winter, because there's no point in taking it to the subarctic land of North Dakota. And so we are together, Russ and I. We've been together now for the most of the last 2 weeks. I was with Russ and Liz and our friend Sarah Vollmer in New Orleans, and that was mostly a gastronomic tour, although we did some civil rights things there. And then I caught up with Russ in Shreveport and had extraordinary adventures there, and got to Shreveport, where Liz Eagle has a family farm. And so we spent the night there, had a great time with her sister Sandra, and then the following morning, Russ and I got in the rig. I never thought I'd get him in the rig, but I did, actually. And when he got into the truck, into the GMC 2013 pickup, typical Russ, he said, "Man, I never expected it to be clean." You know, he's seen the chaos of my life on various occasions, but I actually stopped in Texarkana and spent 3 hours not only repacking the rig and cleaning it out, even including the floorboards, because, you know, Russ is a fastidious person. But anyway, I did that, and so then I came, and we've been in it since. So we went from there to Jackson, where we went to the Medgar Evers home, which is a national monument, at dusk, which was very moving. And he was cut down by a white supremacist from across the street around midnight on July 12, 1963. And by the way, that was the same day that JFK delivered his televised address about civil rights, which was one of the best speeches that JFK ever gave. So we did that and stayed the night in Jackson. The next day then we got up and went to Selma, to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and on to Montgomery, to the state capitol, where there is a world-class, absolutely first-rate and magnificent museum about the race history of the United States, which was so moving that I'm still stunned by what we encountered and ashamed of my ignorance and convinced of our complicity in this appalling story. You know, all this talk about, from the Ron DeSantis types, that, you know, we only can tell a positive story and look how far we've come, and we shouldn't be allowing race to be at the center of our curriculum and so on. That's nonsense. You cannot know this country unless you know its appalling race history. It's not like, slaves were living on plantations where conditions weren't great, and then there was the Emancipation Proclamation, and yes, things have been difficult since, but now finally, etc. That story does not hold up. And so I'm very pleased that we have gone on this pilgrimage. I wanted to end my Steinbeck journey with a civil rights tour. Why? Because Steinbeck ended his journey essentially when he witnessed the integration of the William Frantz Elementary School in New Orleans. That's where Ruby Bridges, whom he calls this little mite of a girl, was being escorted as the first black student into this elementary school in November and December of 1960, and Steinbeck wanted to see that. This had been in the news, and so he ventured there incognito as usual, and he was so horrified by what he saw that he essentially curtailed the journey and bolted home just as fast as he could. And I didn't want it to end that way. I wanted it to end in a productive way, in a way that would enlighten me, and I hope enlighten you all too. And so I decided to do a civil rights tour, to go to Birmingham, to go to Selma, to go to Montgomery, to go to New Orleans. And I asked Russ Eagle, who's a Southerner, I'm a Northerner, I'm from North Dakota. Our race issues are very different ones. I asked him if he would be willing to, if he wanted to come along, and frankly, I didn't expect that he would. But he said yes immediately, and he said that, you know, we have a moral duty to make this pilgrimage if we can, particularly in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder back in 2020, in May 25th, 2020, and all that has followed from that. This was a very moving set of experiences, and it's been a very amazing adventure, you know, beginning at Long Island, at his home at Sag Harbor, and crossing into Connecticut and going up to the top of Maine, and then down to Niagara Falls and around the bottom of the Great Lakes and up to North Dakota, where he had the famous encounter with the itinerant actor on October 12, 1960, and then through Montana and Idaho and Washington to Seattle, and then down along the coast of California and Oregon, including the Redwoods, and to Monterey and Salinas, where I gave a talk. It seems like a year ago now, it's just a few months ago, for the John Steinbeck National Interpretive Center there. And then to Needles, California, and across on Route 66 all the way to Amarillo, even though I'm bone tired and so ready to, as my daughter would say, chill out in my home in North Dakota. So we'll go to the show. Russ has been a wonderful friend, one of my chief critics, but he's also an extraordinarily good friend and a faithful friend, and his intelligence and his perspective are essential to my happiness. And I can't imagine, except for his wife and the gumbo incident, but I won't go there. I can't imagine any better way to end this trip than to roll into Salisbury, North Carolina with Russ Eagle, and I'm going to get to see the famous basement where he has all of his Steinbeck books, all of his Lewis and Clark books, all of his books from our winter retreats, video games, jukeboxes, posters, baseball memorabilia, you name it. It's legendary. Very few people have seen it, and very few people who've seen it have lived to tell the tale. But I think I will get in and out safely, and then it's home. So we'll keep talking. Russ and I will do more programs on this trip, but this one was of great importance to me, and I hope you will listen to it very carefully. And most of all, I hope you will make your own way onto the Civil Rights Trail and go to the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, and certainly to go to the fabulous, magnificent, unbelievable Civil Rights Museum, the Legacy Museum in the capital of Alabama, Montgomery. It's one of the best things that I have ever done. So let's go to the show.
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Listening to America. This is Russ Eagle, your guest host, and happy to say that I finally, after 18,000 miles, caught up with Clay in New Orleans. We've now made our way up the road a little bit to Birmingham. It's good to see you.
My friend, it's great to see you. We are in Birmingham, Alabama. Tomorrow we have a couple of appointments, including at the 16th Street Baptist Church and also at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And then we'll be heading to your house in Salisbury, North Carolina. I've never been there, and so I've much wanted to see it. And I caught up with you in New Orleans first for a few days with your wife, Liz. That was the great gumbo quest of 2024. And I will say to the audience everywhere that Ray's gumbo is certainly the best gumbo I've ever eaten. Now, I'm not a gumbo expert. I've probably had 20 cups or bowls of gumbo in my life, but it certainly was a great gumbo. So thanks to Ray for that. My mind is still open, Russ, about other gumbos. And you know, you and I were in Jackson, Mississippi the other night. We went to a Cajun restaurant, a Southern restaurant. And I ordered gumbo, and they said, oh, no, sorry, we're out of gumbo. It's so popular that we don't have it. And you later, I believe, said I was probably lucky there.
Yeah, that wasn't quite up to the standards of the restaurants we went to in New Orleans. And I think, you know, if Liz had been there, she would have said, you know, that's what you get for straying over the border into Mississippi. She
would have been haughty, as always, about this, but I'm willing to concede for the moment. But we're on a much more important subject today, aren't we?
We are. You know, there were some lighthearted times and fun times in New Orleans. The food, a trip down the river, a riverboat trip.
In a steamboat, an actual steam-driven boat.
Right, and beyond that, you know, it's been a lot more serious trip. I guess we're going to talk about it, but it's pretty well documented that New Orleans was a hard time for Steinbeck, and he sort of shut down once he left New Orleans.
So he's on this 1960 Travels with Charlie trip. He's gone all the way out to Seattle and down to Monterey Bay and across to Flagstaff and over to Amarillo, where he had Thanksgiving. And then he crosses Texas pretty quickly And then he comes to New Orleans, and he had an experience in New Orleans that was shattering.
It was, and he sought it out. This had been, Steinbeck talks about, I guess this was one of the early days of television news, but this story was dominating the news that he was seeing in Texas and throughout the South. And
this was a protest by white, angry people of New Orleans against the integration of the school system of New Orleans. And I believe it began on November 14th.
That is correct.
1960, and he had read about it in the press. I mean, it was an AP story all over the country and on television news. And he says he wanted to see it for himself. So let me just set the scene. He comes into New Orleans. He parks at a parking lot somewhere because he knows that his New York license plates on the pickup are likely to be provocative, and takes a taxi over to the site of the William Frantz School.
That's right, disguised as in his British Navy hat and trying to adopt a British accent.
He said he had his hat, which he wore often on this trip, had a lion and a unicorn on it, and he said, in a port town like New Orleans, nobody even notices sailors, so I thought that was my best chance of being incognito. But before he got there was a preliminary setup incident in the parking lot.
The parking attendant made some not only racist comments, but anti-Semitic comments regarding Steinbeck being from New York, but assured him that if you just want to watch and not make trouble, then you're in for quite a show, I think was the term.
He says, you're really going to see something interesting here. And it was clear that he was on the side of the white nationalists who wanted to prevent this. And so Steinbeck already has a kind of a sickening feeling because he's just parking his car, and this parking attendant is clearly a racist, clearly against the integration of the schools, and also enthusiastic about the show, the circus that's taking place in the Ninth Ward. And you and I and Liz, in an Uber ride from the great Gumbo restaurant, got a great Uber driver, and she agreed to take us around to a number of places, and we had a lovely, I won't say lovely, we had an important tour of the Ninth Ward, including whole sections of it that have never been rebuilt since 2005 when Katrina swept through. That was heartbreaking in and of itself. And then she took us to the school, and it was there that in early December 1960, having come by taxi, Steinbeck elbowed his way into this large and enthusiastic crowd. He said it was like a happening, that people were all excited to get there, and there was pushing and shoving and, stand back. That was the sort of atmosphere there.
Yes, and our driver grew up in the Ninth Ward. She knew its history, the hurdles faced by people still struggling to rebuild.
Some has never been rebuilt, and she said some never will be rebuilt.
Right. She took us to I think it's the William Frantz Elementary School, I think is what's known as the Ruby Bridges School.
It was a weekend, so it was not open.
It's not.
There's signage on the property.
There's signage on the lawn. We could see inside to see that there was signage inside as well.
And photographs and so on. And I think the schoolroom has been preserved as a shrine to civil rights.
Right. If I remember correctly, she was essentially in a classroom by herself.
So he comes into this scene, and it's 9 a.m., and the crowd has gathered, and they know that this group of white, angry women called the cheerleaders are going to do their daily routine. They do it twice a day. Once when she's escorted by U.S. Marshals into the school. They're in plain clothes, but they have U.S. armbands on. And once when she comes out of school and she's being escorted by officers of the federal government of the United States.
Correct.
There's a famous painting by Norman Rockwell of this scene, and we see only the bodies of the marshals, not their heads. Some tomatoes have been splashed up against the wall of the school. And this tiny child, Ruby Bridges, Steinbeck says she's just a mite, the smallest black child that he had ever seen. She's skipping a little bit and moving her way, and she's certainly not happy. And the skip is, he says, probably inadvertent. But Rockwell painted this, and he called it The Problem We All Live With. And it is a very moving painting.
Steinbeck not only describes that same scene you're seeing in the painting, but then he describes what he said was even worse, was when the white parent would arrive at the school.
Singular, a white parent was willing, had the courage to bring his child to that school because all the other white parents were boycotting the school now. They refused, and the teachers had resigned en masse. And so this one man in a gray suit leading his child into that school got more abuse than even Ruby Bridges.
And Steinbeck was so put off by the abuse, the nature of it, that he didn't hold back in his first draft of Travels with Charlie. It's all there.
It's in the J.P. Morgan Library in New York City.
It is. And, Steinbeck, who had built up a lot of currency with his publishers by that time, I think we can safely say he got some things published during his lifetime that other writers may not have. But they drew the line here. And
he said he had never heard this language in his life. And he said, believe me, I have heard salty,
right, disgusting,
obscene, and vulgar language. And I had never witnessed anything like this before. And, at the end of the Grapes of Wrath process, his editors tried to talk him out of some of the more graphic language, right, and graphic scenes. And he said, absolutely not. But in this case, he accepted their decision to lower the tone just a little bit. So we have this African-American Uber driver who could not have been better. She was just so lovely and helpful. And she's giving us a kind of guided tour of the Ninth Ward. She comes here and she said, now this was a school on the white perimeter of the black community there. So this was a largely white school into which Ruby Bridges is being the first black child admitted. And she gave us an orientation that we would otherwise not have had here.
Oh, that's correct. Her name was Letitia. And, she gave us a tour of New Orleans. Even beyond that, she took us places like Fats Domino's house.
Right. And we stopped to take photographs. So we'd say, hey, would you stop here? And she said, okay. And then in the end, we gave her a very large stipend, of course, and with deep gratitude for what she did. But when we were there, we talked about it. The signage is very moving. That was just scene one, but this is the one for us. But that was the one that Steinbeck saw, and it repulsed him to such a degree that he lost a lot of interest in the rest of the trip.
I would say, yeah, he lost all interest. If you read the passages between Texas and New Orleans, he was already
tired.
He was tired, and he talked about how his meals were in gas stations. And it's interesting, when he left New Orleans, he said Charlie, during the course of his life, could always sense when Steinbeck was ill, and rather than wander off like he usually did, he would just come sit with him. And he said when he left New Orleans, Charlie wouldn't leave his side. So he
Charlie sensed the illness, the disease of the heart. He said, I knew something was wrong here. This is where the fairness of Steinbeck comes in, Russ, because he loved New Orleans. He loved the restaurants. He had good friends there. But he says here, my body churned with nausea, but I could not let illness blind me after I'd come so far to look and hear. And suddenly I knew something was wrong and distorted and out of drawing. I knew New Orleans. I have over the years had many friends there, thoughtful, gentle people with a tradition of kindness and courtesy. So I said, I get it. This does not necessarily represent the city of New Orleans. This is one element of New Orleans.
Right, and yeah, he underscored that. Steinbeck was good friends with Rourke Bradford, Lyle Saxon. He talks about Dr. St. Martin down in Houma.
This is increasingly heartbreaking for Steinbeck because this is a city he prizes, and he can't believe that such loathsome racism can exist in a city that's one of the most cultured places in America.
Right, and he hides little hints there at how well he knows New Orleans. He talks about how New Orleans coffee is made.
He makes it in the New Orleans way, and there's a white man that he meets on the river by the side of the road. That man says, oh, you know New Orleans, if you can make coffee like that.
That is true, and the book more or less ends when Steinbeck leaves New Orleans, but he does say he's on his way to Jackson and Montgomery. Which we were in. We'll continue with this trip when we come back, talk about our own trip to Jackson and to Montgomery and beyond.
Yeah, Russ, he had 4 paradigmatic encounters with 2 black individuals and 2 white individuals as he left New Orleans, and they're really an amazing part of this book. So we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll look at what happened after he left New Orleans in disgust. You're listening to a very special edition of Listening to America. We are in a Comfort Inn in Birmingham, Alabama. We've had just an extraordinary civil rights tour ourselves. We'll be talking about it. We'll be back in just a minute.
Welcome back to Listening to America. I'm here in Birmingham, Alabama with Clay. This is Russ Eagle. We left New Orleans several days ago. Steinbeck left New Orleans. He encountered 4 individuals.
Yeah, let me just quickly make a summary of that, Russ. So he met 2 black individuals, both men. So the first one was a white man, an elderly man, who had silver hair and a great bushy white mustache. And Steinbeck was eating a po' boy that he had taken on the run to get out of town. And he's by the side of the great river. And I think the fact that this takes place on the Mississippi River, which we think of as the river of Huckleberry Finn, and he encounters this man who lives nearby, and they have a conversation. Then as he's driving, he sees an elderly black man who's dressed as a field hand, and he offers him a ride. And it's clear that the man is not really wanting to get in this white person's truck, but he does. And they have a conversation. Then a little bit later, he's in a diner, because he believed that diners are where you get most of your conversations. And he's sitting next to a white man who turns out to be a profound white racist. And then finally, he picks up one more person on his, I think between Jackson and Montgomery, where we were on that road just yesterday. And that is a young African-American who is scholarly. He has 3 fountain pens in his breast pocket. He's clearly a student, and they have a conversation. So let me just say this. I mean, some people believe that the 4, one young man who's impatient with the slow pace of civil rights, an older black man who's afraid to even talk about it because he just doesn't want to stir anything up, a vicious white racist in a diner, and then a kind of ambivalent but sympathetic man who knows that this is the tragedy of the American South. Some people, as you know, Russ, think that that's just a little too tight, a little too pat, a little too maybe contrived.
Well, they may be composites. Steinbeck would do that. Steinbeck would not find anything wrong with that.
But I believe they're true, don't you?
Oh, certainly.
I believe he had these encounters.
Yes, he probably tidied them up to emphasize the aspects of the encounters he wanted to emphasize, but no, I don't think for a minute that he made them up.
So I think and they could be composite, and they didn't necessarily occur in exactly that sequence on exactly that day. But I think that they did occur more or less as we have them. I don't think he's making this up.
Certainly ring true. All 4 of them, those types, he would have encountered those types of people. So.
Of course, they are enough like types that's what leads some critics to think, this is probably a bit contrived. But let's just go through them. So the first one, this older man, and they get into this, and Steinbeck is sort of behaving in a Socratic way. And so he says, what do you think about all this? And at first the man is a little cautious, doesn't know what he's up against. Then they get to know each other quite a bit. And the question is, will the black community that's now rising ever be satisfied?
Right. And sort of setting this up, it's made clear that this man comes from a long line of Southern families. And so, Steinbeck sets him up as the viewpoint from a longtime New Orleans resident or Southerner.
So the man is not a political liberal, but he does understand that these are changes, that integration and racial equality, this has to happen. And he's uneasy about it because he thinks once you open this door, you can't control exactly what's going to happen. And you can see that he feels really a tragic sense of the conflicts that are about to be generated in the South.
Right, and he says he knows where things are headed. It's the means of getting there that scares him, and that's pretty much what he ends with. I know where we're heading, but I'm worried about how we're going to get there.
What are the means to get to racial equality? And then he mentions towards the end of the conversation that he lives alone, but he has an elderly black couple that take care of him. And he says sometimes when we're just sitting in chairs in the evening, we sort of forget the situation. It just feels okay. It feels comfortable. It feels natural even. But he said we can't forget.
No, and I've known families like that. So again, it very much rings true. I don't, Steinbeck wrote this book in the Caribbean, much of it. You just don't see him cooking up stuff like that in the Caribbean that rings as true as this does.
I don't think so either. But this older white man predicts a lot of race anxiety and tension to come. So that's the first of the encounters. The second one is with this older black man who's wearing the work clothes from the field, and he's not going very far, and Steinbeck is going to give him a ride. And Steinbeck very carefully starts to open this conversation, like, do you know what's going on? Are you following it? And what happens?
The man resists. He cannot relax at all. We've all been in situations where you're just not comfortable, but you also feel powerless to step out of the situation. And so, Steinbeck said he could physically see him withdrawing.
He leans over into the door and squeezes his body into the smallest possible dimension and makes it clear, doesn't ever make eye contact with John Steinbeck. And it's clear that he's afraid to even raise this question. The idea is that he's an older black man who's lived his life, who knows the situation, essentially American apartheid, and he doesn't want to stir the pot, and he certainly doesn't want to stir the pot with some stranger who picks him up by the side of the road.
Right, he refers to Steinbeck as captain.
Yeah. And
he just keeps saying, fine, captain, just fine. And I don't know nothing about that, captain. I don't know if he convinces Steinbeck. Steinbeck finally realizes that he's putting this guy in an impossible situation.
He believes, I shouldn't have done this. I should not have made him uncomfortable in the way that I have.
The man says, you can drop me off here. I live right up the road. But, Steinbeck looks in his rearview mirror and sees the guy just continue walking down the road. It was just...
He knows that he's not telling the full truth there. He just wants out. And so he says, please let me out. It's not... drop me off when you feel like it. He wants to get out of that pickup just as quickly as he can.
Right.
So that's the second of the encounters. All right, so the third encounter occurs the next morning at a diner. He happens to be sitting next to a man who's well-dressed. He has a long blonde hair that he's very vain about and keeps taking out a comb to groom himself. And Steinbeck says, this is a conversation I shouldn't have started. I know better. I did it. I regret it. But he eases his way into the story of the cheerleaders. And what happens?
Needless to say, the man riding with him takes up the case of the cheerleaders. He says, wasn't that something? Especially that Nellie. She really ripped the roof off. And then he adds, it does your heart good to see somebody doing their duty.
It does your heart good to see somebody doing their duty. So in other words, he thinks that this is righteous protest that has to happen to protect the South from the amalgamation of the two races.
Right, and that's really the comment that pushes Steinbeck over the edge, So he questions, and they're doing it out of duty, and the man says, yeah, sure, God bless them. Comes a time when a man's got to sit down and think, and that's the time you make up your mind to sell your life for something you believe in.
And that's Steinbeck off, because his internal dialogue is really, you're going to give your life for this cause. So he says, really? Right. You want to give your life to this cause? And that really angers the young man.
Yeah, and he talks about how his kids would never go to school with any blacks, and Steinbeck says, how many children do you have? And of course he has none.
But he says that he would kill all the black children rather than let his child go to school with them. And then he starts to call Steinbeck an N-lover. Yeah, you're nothing but a commie N-lover.
And Steinbeck says, I'm not a white lover either, if it includes those noble cheerladies. And they almost come to blows.
Well, a detail we forgot to add is that at the diner, the young man asked Steinbeck to give him a ride. And so the actual conflict occurs in the cab of the pickup. And at that point, when they nearly come to blows, Steinbeck says, get out. Get out.
Right. The opening of the scene actually reminds me of the beginning of The Grapes of Wrath, when Tom Joad gets the ride with the trucker,
And there's some tension in their conversation.
Right.
So Steinbeck orders him out, and he says, "You gonna make me?" And Steinbeck makes a gesture as if he's got a gun or a club or something, and then the guy gets out, and Steinbeck says he slammed the door as hard as it was possible, much to the annoyance of Charlie.
And kept screaming.
N-lover, 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 N-lover.
Drove out of sight.
And then finally, there's one more, and Steinbeck says, and then there was one more before this set of encounters ended, and this is with a young black believer that the pace of change is too slow.
Right. He picked him up between Jackson and Montgomery. He describes him as a young Negro student with a sharp face and the look and feel of impatient fierceness. He says he was very alert, but he noticed here that his license plate relaxed the young man as opposed to putting him on alarm.
So they drive along for a while. He eventually drops him off in Montgomery. The conversation turns to Martin Luther King, and this is when Martin Luther King was still rising. He was not that well known nationally yet, but he was a famous advocate for peaceful, nonviolent protest along the lines of Gandhi and Henry David Thoreau. And the young man says, I don't know, I don't think we can wait that long. That probably isn't going to get it done in my lifetime, and I want to live to see the change.
He gets pretty excited about it, pretty demonstrative about it, but at the end, Steinbeck's driving off, he has tears in his eyes. He says, I'm ashamed of what I'm saying, but I've got one life and I want to see it in my lifetime.
And so this was a debate that grew stronger over time. I mean, I remember when Martin Luther King was assassinated in the spring of 1968. I was just 13 years old. And the debate then was, is Martin Luther King relevant any longer? Because the Black Power movement, led by people like Malcolm X, said, we're not going to wait. Why should we wait for white people to see the light? We're going to have to force this, and it may take violence, and peaceful protest is not the answer. It hasn't worked, and Martin Luther King is an impediment to the success of the movement. And Martin Luther King was in some disarray at the end of his life. He became more sainted afterwards because of the assassination. But at this time, this young man, back in 1960, speaks for the impatience of the black community in the face of the idea of nonviolent resistance.
He does, and like we talk about a lot of Steinbeck's fictional characters, like Tom Joad, for example. It would be interesting to know where this young man's life went.
It would be, and so he's clearly a student. He's an intellectual. Steinbeck says he has a wad of papers in his breast pocket, and he has 3 fountain pens, and so that's clearly a sign that this is a young, well-educated, very well aware of the dynamics of the civil rights movement man. So you have those 4, and it happens in rapid succession in about 6 pages in Travel to Charlie. I think, Russ, that these are some of the best pages in the book.
Oh, I do too. And Steinbeck complained or lamented the fact throughout the country that people didn't seem to have opinions. And certainly he found opinions when he reached the South.
He says a number of times in Travels with Charlie that it's an election year, Kennedy v. Nixon. He saw all the debates on television at one place or another. And he says, I can't get people to talk about it. People just don't want to talk about this. They just turn away from that conversation. And finally he gets a conversation. Well, he gets 2 conversations about current events, doesn't he? One with his sisters, which goes very, very badly because they're Nixon lovers, and they call him a communist at one point. And that's sort of when he concludes you can't go home again. Your own family is somebody you can't really talk about the big issues with. And the atomic bomb comes up a couple of times, once in Connecticut and once in New Orleans. But the second of the main current events conversations is about civil rights. And then, as you said at the beginning of the program, Steinbeck just throws his hands up and goes home.
2 paragraphs after he leaves that last man, he's in New York.
And he gets lost coming into Manhattan and has to have a cop tell him how to get to his place. He's bewildered, he's tired, he's spiritually exhausted. As you said, he was already showing signs of fatigue back in Monterey, but this incident had a profound effect on him.
It does, and I don't think it's an accident that he ended the book this way. I mean, other than the little sort of humorous note that you mentioned where he gets back to New York and that's where he gets lost in his home city. But other than that, those few paragraphs, he ended the book with these 4 individuals.
So what do you make of that? So when we think of Travels to Charlie, if you ask 100 people about Travels to Charlie, they don't bring this up. They talk about the dog and the whimsy and the more cheerful encounters that he had and getting a flat tire and so on and so forth. That's the Travels to Charlie we remember, and we tend not to remember that one of the perhaps the most intense incident in the entire book is this last one.
Right. I don't know that people want to remember that. I think a lot of the popularity of this book was that there was so much of Steinbeck, the man, in it. After, regardless of where his critical reputation was, he was always an incredible popular writer all around the world, sold hundreds of thousands of books, and yet, more or less hid his personal life from the public.
This is Travels with Charlie is his most revealing book about himself, his attitudes, growing old. He knows his excellence is in decline, and so is his physical life. And in a certain sense, that allows him to relax a little because he has little left to prove. He's proved whatever he's going to prove with East of Eden and The Winter of Our Discontent and those late books. And now I think he's willing to reveal himself, really for the first time, on this kind of whimsical journey he makes around the country.
Right, and I think it's an indication of where he was in his life at that time. He was relaxed, at least from a domestic sense. He was happy. He also knew that, he always used acting or stage metaphors, and he knew it was about time to exit the stage, is the way he would say it.
Yes. And there are theatrical references throughout the book, and there's a sense of nothing left to prove, I think, in Travels with Charlie.
There is. And also, having read his letters, at different periods in Steinbeck's life, there were people he was writing to almost daily. Pat Covici is one that, covers about...
his publisher, Viking.
Yes, his editor and publisher, covers about 30 years. But when he was writing Travels with Charlie, this was one of those times when he was writing Covici regularly. And if you read those letters, Steinbeck really struggled with writing this book, with coming up with a structure that he thought said something. And he wrote to Covici when he was finished, "You'll have to tell me what you think. This is the first time in my life that I have no idea whether the book I've written is any good."
Amazing that he would say that, because it turns out to be some people's favorite Steinbeck book. It's certainly the most accessible, easily accessible of his works.
And I think this last section that we've been talking about, that alone makes it an important book.
So, Russ, I think we haven't done justice to this book. You never really can, but I think we've certainly placed the civil rights movement and those encounters with the cheerleaders and the 4 paradigmatic conversations he had as the climax of the book. And it creates a kind of cloud over the end of the book, and it certainly created a cloud for him because he just rushed home and wanted to get really into the arms of his loving wife, Elaine, and back to his normal life.
And for that reason, I've always thought, that's one of the criticisms, is the abrupt ending.
But he's always abrupt ending.
Right. But I thought it was fitting. I thought the abrupt ending sort of underscored the way he felt leaving the South.
Well, let me put it in a slightly different way. He wants to go see America, and he sees America, and he sees the homogenization of American culture and the coming of plastic and the coming of throwaway culture and fast food and the interstate highway system, the blandness of America now that it's having standard restaurants and so on. He also has a very quirky interest in the rise of mobile home culture. But there's a sense in which he's kind of having a fun ride around America, and suddenly he hits the wall of a very, very serious American problem. And I think that really upset him.
But, he had said all along he was looking for opinions. So, it's sort of be careful what you ask for.
Russ, we need to take a break. We want to talk about the journey you and I have been making, and I chose to do this and asked you to come along and was delighted that you agreed to do it. I didn't want us just to quit. I wanted us to end the journey by looking at civil rights with fresh eyes. We'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll try to tell that story. This is a special edition with my friend Russ Eagle of Listening to America. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Listening to America. This is Russ Eagle. Clay, we left, like Steinbeck, we left New Orleans. We've talked about what happened to Steinbeck once he pulled out of the Crescent City, but we've had our own adventure.
I've spent a lot of time with you and Liz over the past few weeks. I frankly never thought I'd get you into Rocinante. I thought that you would just say, nah, you're on your own. You have agreed to take the rig for the winter and put it in storage, but I was so glad when you agreed to do this, and you and Liz and I had a spectacular time in New Orleans. It was really kind of a foodie trip in certain ways, but we did go to some sites, some Steinbeck sites, and particularly the William Frantz Elementary School. But I've been planning this kind of civil rights pilgrimage as a way of closing my trip. I wanted my climax to be powerful, and man, has it been powerful? So just to summarize, we were in Shreveport. We then went to Jackson, Mississippi, where we went to the Medgar Evers National Monument.
Right.
Medgar Evers was killed on June 12, 1965, by a white supremacist outside his home in a modest neighborhood of Jackson, Mississippi. And then we went from there to Selma,
Right.
where we crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, something I've always wanted to do. Then we rushed on to Montgomery, and I did not know what to expect in Montgomery, but that turned out to be the most powerful element of the entire journey, and we'll talk about that. And then finally tomorrow, I'm taking you to a place that I just was at a few weeks ago, the Civil Rights Institute of Birmingham, where we're going to get a special tour by its curator, and we'll go to the 16th Street Baptist Church, and then we will bolt like Steinbeck for Salisbury, North Carolina. So talk a little bit about this. So what really struck me as so interesting is when I mentioned this to you and said, here's what I want to do, and said, would you like to come along? You immediately said yes, which I did not necessarily expect. And then you said, and repeated it again yesterday, that you believe, and I do too, that people have a moral duty to make this pilgrimage.
Yes, I think if you can't, how can you call yourself an American if you can't face up to where we came from with all the warts? That seems like a pretty tame term to use with what we saw yesterday. It's not easy to do.
It's been rough. It's been emotionally and spiritually exhausting. I was so exhausted last night, I didn't get a good night of sleep, and we can explain why. But so I believe this is a pilgrimage everyone should take, and I do urge everyone listening, if you get the chance to do some or all of this, and there's more than we have done, but I think we've made a good run at it. Let's start with Medgar Evers. I did not know a lot about that incident, I have to say. So we read about it. We have a book here called The Civil Rights Trail, and of course there's the internet and histories of the civil rights movement. When we got to that neighborhood, it was about dusk, and it was a very modest neighborhood. This is not an interpretive center that's on some public land. This is the house where he was cut down on June 12, 1965, and I think both of us felt a little uneasy there.
Right. I mean, you can't, especially with your rig that we're traveling in, you can't really visit it without parking in front of somebody's house. This neighborhood is still there, probably looks more or less like it did in the 1960s. And so, yeah, you sort of feel like you're stepping on toes, so to speak.
You're in somebody's actual neighborhood, and it felt a little, it's I wouldn't say it's a marginal neighborhood, but it's not a prosperous neighborhood. And, the house is right next, very close to two other houses where people are living.
And they're very close to the road. I mean, the front yard is just 10 feet maybe.
He was a civil rights worker. He was the Mississippi director for the NAACP for 8 years. He had investigated 9 unsolved crimes and had given speeches and so on. And so a white supremacist waited for him. He came home around midnight, was standing in his driveway when this man shot him with a .30-06 from 150 yards away, from directly across the street.
And there really is no doubt as to who shot him.
But he was twice acquitted.
He was twice acquitted.
By white juries. And when we went to Montgomery and went to this museum we're going to be talking about, what we learned, which we knew anyway, was that this is a pattern of white juries refusing to find guilty people who are obviously guilty of the crimes for which they were being tried.
Right. It's just one of the themes that was repeated.
A constant theme in American life. To this day, but less so now, of course, than before.
Right.
So we were there, and it was dusk, and that, I think, made it particularly moving. We went on, and the next day we got up and went to Selma. So what were your impressions of crossing the famous, even the infamous Edmund Pettus Bridge? People will remember that incident occurred on March 7th, 1965, and this was the famous march to Montgomery for the bus boycott and for all that was going on in Montgomery at the time. Martin Luther King was part of it. John Lewis, the later congressman from the state of Georgia and a very important civil rights leader, was beaten nearly to death on that occasion. So this group of several hundred people, not all black, but mostly African Americans, marching to the state capitol to demand racial justice are stopped by law enforcement officers and posses and militia and beaten severely on national television. And that's why it became one of the flashpoint incidents of the civil rights movement.
And if you watch those old reports, which I did in preparation for going there, it is you can see it is very disturbing. We were talking on one of your shorter posts, I think. The thing that stood out to me, it's a tall bridge.
It's an arch.
It's an arch, and it serves as a boundary on one side of the arch. I mean, as soon as you step off the bridge, you're in the midst of town.
I mean, you are immediately in the main street of the downtown of Selma, Alabama. Brick and colonial style buildings, shops, etc.
But the other side, even today, is run down, mostly rural. So certainly it was in the early 1960s. But it just plays the part of the boundary that we think of it as.
This is after Steinbeck. So Steinbeck went through in 1960. This is 1965. This is where John Lewis became a national figure. And I believe, yes, I'm certain that this is true, that one of the networks was showing a documentary about the Nuremberg trials in Germany after World War II. And they interrupted the program to show what was happening in Selma, Alabama, which adds a certain deep, tragic irony to all of this. We all know that Hitler learned lessons from American civil apartheid in his own pogroms against Jews, homosexuals, communists, and others, that he looked to America as a model, how to handle classes and communities that he found offensive to the future of Nazi Germany. And so this happened again in March 1965, which was also the year that Vietnam was beginning to be a major factor in American life. And so we crossed the bridge. We walked across it a couple of times. I had not thought about how close it was to town. I thought it was in the country somewhere. I had no idea what river it spanned. It's the Alabama River. And so in other words, no matter how much you read, being there is essential, isn't it?
It is. I've talked about that on the show in a number of places, like the Lewis and Clark Trail. Mm-hmm. It just increases your understanding exponentially to be in these places.
When we crossed the bridge, we were recording, but the recording was damaged by the incessant traffic of trucks, cars, pickup trucks with bad mufflers, and the rumble. The bridge almost bounces. And it seemed to me so inappropriate that they have not closed that bridge and made it its own pure shrine.
Right, and you cannot even walk across it without some
dangerous.
trepidation. It is dangerous.
Because these cars are racing by, and the curb is, 4 inches. There's no guardrail. There is, of course, against the river, but if you tripped and fell into the traffic, or if a car jumped the curb, it would create mayhem. And, you can't put it out of the realm of possibility that someone would deliberately do that.
Right. I was constantly aware of that as we walked across, so...
Very moving. And I thought that was going to be the highlight, the most potent of the things that we did. But boy, were we wrong. So we went on to Montgomery, and we were fighting the clock a little bit, and we went to the Legacy Museum, which is new, in the heart of the capital of Alabama. It's a tens of millions of dollars facility. And I will just say, I've never been to a more powerful museum experience than that one.
No, the only thing I can think of, even in that range, would be the Holocaust Museum, at least that I visited.
Very similar sense of just the cloud that gathers over you. And so let's just describe a few of the things. There are holograms of people in jail cells. These would be slaves who are being locked up. There are a number of African Americans in jail, and you sit down at a booth and you pick up the phone as you would if you were visiting them, and they tell their story. The walls are just full of text, some of it descriptive, but the ones that really are disturbing are the quotations by white supremacists, and they have not spared us. They have quoted them in large letters and in great detail and proliferated all over the building of the things that white people said from 1619 until 1965 and even beyond. And I don't know about you, but I thought I knew a lot about this, but I have never been so... I had the same feeling that Steinbeck had with the cheerleaders. I thought, can it be that white people can have been that disgusting and demeaning and violent in their rhetoric? But the answer is yes.
Yes, and this is a huge facility, and you just go from one room to the next, and it just hits you in the face. On one wall, there's an entire wall of jars of dirt.
Oh, man.
From various lynching sites around the country.
So these are not people's remains, but they went to the sites of lynchings. There have been more than 4,000 lynchings. And they went to the sites of some of them and got dirt. And you have black dirt and red dirt and brown dirt and yellow dirt. And these jars are probably a gallon in size, and they're lined up on the wall. And then the story, the names of the people lynched are right there. And it's
sort of
chilling.
emphasizes this was not a local problem anywhere.
So, and there's also a wall that has nothing but auction information about auctioning a young 13-year-old girl, a 17-year-old boy. He's a good worker, but he has a shriveled hand, etc. Just at one after the next of these auctions, and it's amazing how morally indifferent these sale bills are.
Yeah, I think that was the room that was hardest for me to take, even worse than the room on violence, which was a whole other thing.
We saw, for example, walls about lynching and the descriptions of the lynching. So a white posse is looking for a black man who looked crosswise at a white woman. And they're going through rural country, and they see two other black men and ask them where that culprit is. They won't cooperate, so they kill them. They just shoot them. And when they find the person, there's no due process, there's no judicial system, there's no judge, there's no presentation of evidence. Tied to a tree, tortured, dismembered, kerosene poured on them, shot up, butchered, lit on fire, and then people took parts of the bodies home as souvenirs.
Right, and there were also displays of the chains and manacles and all sorts of just wicked-looking devices that were used to constrain people.
The first room is this giant television screen where you see the ocean voyages of the 12 million Africans who were brought to the New World between 1500 and 1865. That in itself is a very powerful introduction. But then in the next room, remember, there are all those, I guess they're terracotta busts of people who are buried in sand, and the devices used to constrain them. Look, they're straight out of a torture manual.
Exactly. And, then a lot of graphics, there is a world map on a screen, and then there's a counter up in the corner, for the last 500-600 years, whatever it was, and it counts off.
Like a Wall Street thing,
or it counts off 1 year at a time, and you see these little blips like a radar of all the slave ships that sailed from this part of the world to that part. And it's stunning from the beginning, but then when it starts to hit North America, and then there are just so many slave ships going, it's just almost like a steady line instead of these blips. It's mind-blowing.
That's what disturbed me so much. I don't typically like that kind of graphic, but this was perfectly done. And so you see these little black dots of ships coming across, and they start by going to the Caribbean and South America, and then around 1619 you get one little ship in the Virginia Capes, and then 5, and then 8, and then suddenly it's just trafficking through from 1619 until 1865, and you see it. And when that first starts to go north, Russ, your heart just sinks. You think, why? If we had avoided that for whatever reason, if it had stayed in the Caribbean and South America, America would be a fundamentally different place.
Right, and it just picks up. It's almost like watching automatic weapon fire in a video game. Just
or
relentless.
early Pac-Man kind of a thing. It's
right.
It's very simple, but the effect is overwhelming.
Yes.
So then we went through this museum, and we rushed a little because it would probably take 3 or 4 days to read it all. But I don't think that any person with a full heart could stand to read all of it in one period.
You need, even just physically, you need a day to get in this museum now. Psychically, you may need a week or a month to get through it. I don't know.
So, Russ, then we went to this monument to lynching, which is about a mile away. And that was very powerful, too, because it has these plinths that hang from a ceiling. And then on them are inscribed the counties where there were lynchings. And again, there were more than 4,000 lynchings until 1947. It says such and such a county in North Carolina and lists all the people who were lynched.
Right.
And it goes, there are hundreds of them, hundreds of counties, maybe 1,000 altogether.
Yeah, it's a very elaborate, from an architectural sense, tribute. And just those things hanging essentially from the ceiling, it's like you said, you think, well, nothing's going to top that last, nothing's going to affect me like the last stop, and then this just comes up and knocks you back down.
And I hadn't thought about it till you said it, but the hanging from the ceiling evokes lynching too,
Right.
doesn't it?
Yeah.
And so you can only look at a few of them, and you see all these names, and they mean nothing to us except names. But you looked for the county that you come from in North Carolina. I think you found 6.
Right, and I know a little bit of their history, so.
I don't think there have been any lynchings of that sort in my own North Dakota. There have been a couple of lynchings, but I don't think that they're race-related in that way. But this was very chilling. And then it was so well done architecturally because there was a mound, a grassy mound in the middle, like an amphitheater. And there was a sign that said, now imagine 2,000 or 3,000 people watching this lynching and cheering it on and celebrating and taking relics home and getting drunk and thinking that it's a great old festival. And so that, I think, was equally powerful.
And to me, it had sort of an Escher feel to it, like it was never ending. Like you kept going through, and it just, even though it was just a square, it just seemed like you could walk forever and never get to the end of it.
So this is new, and I urge everyone listening to get there and to go to the website and to take a look at it in Montgomery, Alabama. So then I just want to end the program, Russ, with this. We get in the car, in the pickup, and we're now driving to Birmingham. And I think we were both kind of stricken by what we had seen, but we began a conversation about our impressions. And one question you asked was, what's the age of a young person that you would first bring here?
Right. I see things through the eyes of my grandkids at this point in my life. I want them to be exposed to this, but the places we visited yesterday, I know they're not ready for that.
It's too soon for them.
And so, but it makes you wonder, how do you do that? How do you go about sharing that with children?
The second question we asked was, is it too much? Is it too intense? And the answer is yes and no. It is too intense, but of course it has to be, doesn't it?
It has to. The subject is worthy, and the things that happen, the things that you see in there are worthy of that sort of presentation. There's no other way, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
And the third thing that struck me in our conversation about it was that we're both, I would say, on the enlightened end of the spectrum. In other words, we believe that the civil rights movement was the right thing. We entirely respect what happened. We believe in equality. No part of us has any doubts about integration. And we both are pretty well-educated individuals, and yet I was shocked by my ignorance. I was appalled by my ignorance and ashamed of my ignorance. And the ignorance consists of 2 different types, doesn't it? One is ignorance of knowledge and incidents, but the other one is ignorance of the depth of depravity that we're talking about.
That's true. And a third thing that I think is, even if you are aware of these things, it's easy to get complacent about it. Exhibits like we saw, shake you out of that.
I mean, I think that the mission of the museum must be, you will not leave this museum without being deeply troubled by your own country.
Right.
And of course, there will be people who reject that, but I don't think that that's a good thing to reject. And so the final thing we talked about is a little harder to talk about, and that's our own complicity. So many people say, well, of course, horrible things happened, but that was then, and this is now, and I didn't have anything to do with it, and I don't have a racist bone in my body, and so on and so forth. But I think both of us felt that one of the ways you respond to this moment is to admit complicity.
Right. I don't know how you can avoid it, really.
Who knows where we would have been in 1961, where we would have been in 1963, and what our attitudes would have been. I don't think we can know that. I talked to my daughter about it this morning, and she's in Oxford, and I said, I don't know that I would have been on the right side of this question, because we're all products of our time, and the South was a very different place then. You know that better than I do. And people that we love at this point are still racists and are still hold bigoted views of African Americans and so on. So for us to pretend that we would always have been on the right side of every question, I think is a profound mistake.
Right, because it took more than an enlightened view. It took bravery.
Human sacrifice, heads being crushed, people being dismembered, people being shot like Martin Luther King or by Medgar Evers. I mean, think of the violence that it took before we came to something like a moment where the Voting Rights Act could be passed.
Right. It's been a long trip, and it's
not
still
over
far from
yet.
over.
And then finally we decided we had earned the right to have a nice meal. We went to this wonderful steakhouse here in Birmingham, and there were probably, I would say, more than 100 people seated, wouldn't you?
Oh, easily. Yes,
Maybe 200. And it was about half white and half black. And here's what I want to say, and I want to say it carefully. The African Americans who were there were well-heeled, well-dressed, well-groomed. I mean, if they were white, we'd say these are professionals who work out, who take care of their health, who dress beautifully, who are out for a good time, who are willing to spend a fairly large amount of money on a good steak dinner. And I saw nothing but harmony in that room. It was like the two cultures, the two races, had no beef with each other. It was just, didn't you just feel that it was a period of great relaxation?
It was, and I don't know if we would have been so aware of that if we hadn't had the day we just had, but you couldn't help but notice that, and it was a great night.
And don't get us wrong, we understand that is not representative of the lives of African Americans in the United States today, but it does say that Birmingham, and I said this out loud, and your response was even better. I said, however awful this all has been, we have to admit that we've come a long way. And then I think you said, yeah, but to have this conversation tells us what's at stake here, right?
Right.
We're still not there, and we shouldn't even have to have a conversation about how far we've come in a nation whose mission statement is, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That it almost feels like a joke in the face of the racial history, the tragic racial history, and the violent racial history of this country.
Right, and I don't think we have time to start on Jefferson right now.
But he doesn't fare well. I lost respect for Jefferson yesterday.
You can't help it.
And it's not amazing that independently we both lost respect for Thomas Jefferson, because the people that say, oh, well, he was a benevolent slaveholder and all of that, or he's as good as it gets under the circumstances, or he was stuck in this situation. No.
There's no such thing.
There is no way that you can exonerate Jefferson just because he was a genius.
Right.
And just because he wrote the most important statement in American history. You cannot exonerate him and say, well, this is just one element of his life, because all that violence was in him too.
I think you particularly cannot exonerate him because he wrote those words.
So what a way to end, but it's true. I mean, I won't ever think about these questions in the same way, which is why I'm so glad we've done this. I'm just so, you can't say glad exactly, I'm so satisfied that we have taken this pilgrimage and allowed this to grip us. And I don't think that we can see the world in quite the same way.
No, and I think it's a fitting into your trip too, because I think you sort of picked up and made up for Steinbeck's hasty retreat.
Right, and it's not any criticism of Steinbeck, but I wanted to say, what's the right answer to Steinbeck's freaking out over what he saw in New Orleans? And we have done due diligence, but it's only the beginning. We could spend weeks touring these places, and by the way, some of them in the North. It's not just the South. But I think that this is a pilgrimage that I should have taken before. I will try to take again. I hope you and I will do it again. And I think everyone listening should try to figure out how they can get themselves to Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana to do something along this line. And if you can only do one, it's this new museum in Montgomery.
Agreed.
Thank you, everyone. Tough stuff. Too bad for Mr. Jefferson. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.